Welcome to The Indigenous Approach, a podcast where we examine the role of the nation's premier partnership force across the competition continuum, from cooperation to conflict and everything in between. In this episode, Colonel Jeremy Mushtare, commander of the 8th Psychological Operations Group, Dr. Ajit Maan, an internationally recognized security and defense analyst and narrative strategist, and Lieutenant Colonel retired Brian Steed, an instructor of military history at the Army's Command and General Staff College and scholar of cross-cultural influence, discuss the concept of narrative and its impact on influence. More complete bios for all of our guests can be found in the show notes for today's episode.
So I've been able to kind of, read through some of what you all have published, and I think that what our teams have lined up here should be a pretty illuminating conversation all the way around. So, our background here, this is a psychological operations group. There's 2 active duty PSYOP groups. There's 2 in the reserves. We recently did a little bit of a rebalance internally. So we have some battalions are regionally aligned battalions, and they're aligned by geographic combatant commands. And all of those have gone over to the other group, to the 4th group. And then what we have on our side is some of the other components that go into psychological operations. So we have 1 battalion that does multimedia expeditionary dissemination operations. So really what that means is we have some radio and television production capabilities that are both fixed here and then mobile. And that includes digital product development, and includes print and that kind of stuff. And then we also have a battalion that's aligned against special mission units. And then new to us that we began this summer was we stood up an information warfare center that's right here at Fort Bragg, with the purpose of having trans-regional influence activities against our adversaries. And so that's a newer thing. It's a little bit, frankly, overdue for us to be able to do something like that. And that's really about bringing all of these other information-related capabilities together. So you're thinking about cyber and space and military deception and operational security, and actually bringing it together like a task force here. We've had success with those sorts of things in areas of hostilities, but now and you set those up and then you take them down. The idea is to make something that's a little bit more permanent, a little bit more able to be agile and then be leveraged where it needs to be leveraged. So that's kind of our direction. Our thought process is getting into more so how do we do information warfare. My background is, tactical through strategic level. I came here from policy. From OSD policy, I was the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. A lot of changes have happened there over the last year. I've seen kind of how the NSC does stuff. And so I'm really interested where you're talking about focusing on narrative and kind of sussing out the difference on sort of how does the US government see that at the strategic level? How do we see it at our level? And kind of talking through that, as well as the cultural aspect that I think Brian has talked about a lot. And really, how do we train to that kind of thing? If it's even possible to train to the right kind of level of knowledge and experience you would have to do that kind of thing well, to leverage culture in what we're trying to do for influence activities. So with that, I'll open it up to Ajit to go ahead and start us off here.
Okay. Well, I often talk to people about the difference in the way that we use the word narrative as opposed to some, information or stories or messaging, things like that. I use the term, it comes out of narrative identity theory. It's a psychological and philosophically based idea of how identity is created in part through the stories we tell about ourselves. And when it comes to narrative warfare, the difference, I think, if I understand what information warfare is, I think the difference is that narrative warfare isn't really warfare over the information, but it's warfare or struggle or conflict over the meaning of the information. So that means, for example, when disinformation takes, when people or individuals just stick to their belief in certain disinformation despite facts and truths and statistics and information you can give them to the opposite. They do that because the disinformation is more meaningful to them than the information, than the truth. And what does that mean, more meaningful? Ultimately, bottom line, what it means is it promotes and boosts their sense of self. It's their identity that it's meaningful to. And that's the bottom line meaning, right? Who you are and, you know, what you believe in. So that's so there are two main parts to narrative warfare that are just essential to understand, and that is that it has everything to do with identity, and it has everything to do with meaning. And of course, there isn't just one identity. You know, identity has layers. So the more, in terms of influence, the more layers of identity you trigger, the more influential you'll be.
Yeah, I think I'd be interested to understand your perspective on where we stand as a government in being able to do that. And I can give a little perspective on this because, you know, at the National Security Council level, very much so, a lot of what they will talk about in terms of whole of government effort is we have to have the right narrative for the U.S. government. But it seems to be a very inward-looking kind of a narrative development process, right? And doesn't take into account really those audiences in the same kind of way. And I think maybe they think they leave it to the individual embassies, public diplomacy, you know, sections or things like that to kind of craft it the right way based on the audiences. But I think maybe there's a different approach we should take at the strategic level to help account for that. But I'm interested in your thoughts on kind of at the higher up level where you see that we would actually engage in the right fashion.
Yeah, so that's kind of difficult in that what happens is, and here's where the difference between stories and narratives comes in. It's pretty clear that we have a national narrative. It's somewhere located in our Constitution, but the stories that we tell about it are so different. So narratives, how I think of them, are things that are in our cultural environment, in our social environment, and we internalize them pretty early on, pre-verbally, and then we live by them in a kind of, in a way that we're not highly conscious of. And stories, though, we're highly conscious of. We're highly conscious of telling them, listening to them, talking about them. You know, movies are made about narratives, but the movies, the novels, all that stuff, those are stories. They reference a narrative. Those that are familiar with the narrative get the story. They can get what a 3-word tweet means, just a message that messages a story that refers to a narrative. So if you're not familiar with that narrative, stories don't make sense, and the tweets don't make sense, and all the references don't make sense.
The part that I think is important is recognizing the critical role that stories play in connecting people to narrative. And this, I think, is in part where the US government tends to miss these two, because we conflate the term narrative and the term story, and we don't recognize the difference between them and the different roles they play. So if every society has a narrative, and I would argue that most societies, especially complex ones, have more than one narrative. You might have a dominant narrative and then several other maybe minority narratives that exist. But then whoever's governing has a story for how that entity is going to solve for whatever the dissonance of life with that narrative. So if I actually use American narratives more often than others because I think people can wrap their head around them. If the American narrative is the American dream, and whatever that means, like what's beautiful about a narrative, I don't need to explain it. You just know it means something, and it might mean something different to all of the people listening to this. But if that's the American narrative, then and we just went through a political campaign, which makes us even better. Each candidate is going to present their story for how to solve for the dissonance created between the narrative of living the American dream and the reality of life. So each person out there, whatever their vision of the American dream is, they're still struggling to achieve it. Now, maybe that's part of their narrative is a struggle and hard work and whatever. And so somebody who's trying to connect to that might have a story that says, I'm going to facilitate an environment where your hard work will pay off with success. And that each person is going to be treated equally so that your hard work will not be treated more harshly or more beneficial than somebody else's hard work. So the challenge is when we go abroad, as Ajit said, we kind of have an American narrative. I mean, it is in the Constitution of the United States. It's in our Declaration of Independence. It's in our national security strategy, our national military strategies. We tend to re-emphasize that narrative over and over again. But what we don't typically recognize is what is our story to address the dissonance in a given region or a specific country. And so more to your audience as guys who do PSYOPs stuff, what they have to recognize is the very fact that they're in a country means that there's significant dissonance between the governing story and the societal narrative. Like, you wouldn't be there if the governing story narrative connection was working perfectly. One, it never works perfectly, but there's clearly massive disruption that exists, or the United States military PSYOP community wouldn't be present. So already dissonance exists between the story narrative connection. Depending on which side of this we're on, like if we're opposed to the government, then what we want to do, and we always want to do these two things simultaneously. On one hand, we want to increase dissonance between the story of those we oppose and the societal narrative, and we want to increase resonance between the story of the side we favor and the societal narrative. So we're both pulling things together and pushing things apart simultaneously. And I think that concept is not understood at the government level, and it's not understood at the operator level. That this is why it matters. This is why, to me, narrative matters even for the lowest ranking soldier. Because as he's walking down the street in some community in some distant country, his behavior is either increasing resonance or increasing dissonance. He's either, if he's violating societal norms, then what he's doing is, and we were invited there by the host government, then we are increasing the dissonance that exists between the governing story and the societal narrative. If he's behaving well, if he's doing things that are good, then we're increasing the resonance between that governing story and societal narrative. And to me, this is the key operational element, is recognizing, you have to recognize what the underlying societal narrative is, how they interpret the world, but you also have to recognize what are the competing stories and how those stories are or are not connecting to the populace. And then we're either targeting the opposing story to increase that dissonance, or we are, well, and at the same time trying to increase the resonance of the governing story, if we will, or the friendly story. I hope that addresses that. I just see, like, my experience is even folks who understand regions very well do not recognize this complexity of story and narrative in those societies. They might get the culture, they might get the language, they might understand the history, but they don't recognize that narrative. One of many reasons why I have been appreciative of 2020, and I know that's almost heretical to say that, is that 2020 has laid bare a lot of this within the United States. these competing narratives and then the various stories that exist to try to solve for those. And to me, that's an easy place to start, because most people in 2020 can recognize that there are different stories, and they might also recognize that there are different narratives. So without getting political, because I know military folks are very averse to getting political, and this isn't to judge one narrative or the other, but I would suggest that in 2020, you saw very different narratives in the sense that there are people, and I posited 3 narratives in a blog post I wrote, but you kind of have the America is awesome narrative, you have the I have a dream narrative, and you have the America is horribly flawed, institutional America is horribly flawed. So the 1619 narrative, that we are based off of slavery and its problems. And why appreciating that matters is when I deal with somebody who is filtering the world through a 1619 narrative, which I don't filter the world through, I need to recognize that they're not doing it. Some people might be, but most people who adhere to a narrative, they're not being manipulative. That is how they interpret the world. So when they see a Black man getting shot by a police officer, they are interpreting that as a racist act, irrespective of any of the details, because that's how they interpret the facts. Whereas an America is awesome narrative person would be, well, that policeman probably had a reason. Like, that would be their initial interpretation of those facts. And then it would take significant facts on both sides to the contrary of that narrative to potentially convince that person that the other thing is true. And too often, even in American discourse, we attribute bad motives to people who have different narratives, rather than recognizing, no, they just have a different narrative. And we have to appreciate that, otherwise you can't talk. And so to me, it would be a useful thing, although I don't know how many commanders would be comfortable doing it, to start off talking about American competing narratives, and then recognize as you go abroad, those same dynamics, and in many cases even more, exist elsewhere. Because almost every country I interacted with, and that was quite a few, had multiple narratives. So Iraq has what you could call, to just be simplistic, a Sunni, a Shia, a Kurd narrative. And even within each of those communities, there might be one or more narratives that exist. And so appreciating all of those details is part of how you effectively communicate and generate the resonance or dissonance. And I talked a long time, so I'll stop there.
If I might add, I would say that what we need is a narrative analysis to begin to construct a narrative. We need to know, when we go into somebody's country, what is the narrative they're living by? And where we start, not end, but start, is with anthropological study. Then we have to go through, and you can't ask people, so what's your narrative? They don't know what to say. Just like an American, if you ask an American, what's your narrative? They're gonna go, what's that? Is that like a story? You mean, so you know what, you can't ask people to tell you what their narrative is, but you can ask them to tell you their stories. And they love to tell you that. What's the story you live by? What's going on here? What's this? You know, people love to tell you about themselves. And then what you need to do is collect those stories and see what's in common. And there's going to be a common thread that's going to lead you down to their narrative. So an example that I use for American narratives is, you know, or even just more generally a sort of a Western structure of a narrative, is that of the rugged individual who, you know, the hero of the journey, who separates himself out from the crowd, distinguishes himself in some way, and then journeys for something, generally at the, you know, in its beginning, middle, and an end. And at the end of the journey, he's changed in some important way. And Western audiences, I mean, we see this, you know, repeated in all sorts of, you know, stories. So a person may tell you, if you ask an American, a lot of Americans are going to have very similar stories about I'm the little guy journeying, I'm the hero. You know, they may not say it like that, but I struggle. I started here at this place and I'm aiming for something and I'm struggling along the way and I've got knocked down and I've got back up. And so I'm like the, you know, the little guy against the empire. I'm the little guy against the fates. I'm the, you know, that sort of thing. They're not going to say I'm the rugged individual, you know, but they're going to tell you a story about it. And from hearing those kind of stories, you can get what the narrative is. But Brian's absolutely right that even if you ask an American, now, and this is, I think, increasingly so, you're going to hear something that we haven't heard up until recently too much of, which is a victim story, a victim narrative. That has come out more. We see entire cultures that are based on a victim narrative. And so then you get all those stories. That is something that's increasingly obvious here. And that's going to be, just like Brian was talking about, there's going to be some conflict. You know, everybody isn't living the same narrative, even in the United States. So we need narrative analysis to understand the narrative people are living by. We gather that information by listening to their stories. And then we have to, if we want to influence them, it would, depending on what we want to do, you know, so a bad guy who wanted to influence somebody to do something that they were not inclined to do otherwise might, well, I call it pathologize the narrative. Kind of in a good way, a really good start is to convince the person that they're a victim. It's really easy if they really are a victim, and a little more difficult if they're not, but it can still be done so that, you know, you paint them as a victim. And you can see this in terrorist recruitment narratives all over, you know, through history and all over the world. The narrative goes something like, you know, we were the land of milk and honey. Everything was great until these others came. And then the others brought with them all this pestilence, and, you know, maybe they're metaphors of crops going bad and bad weather and people don't get along anymore and stuff like that. And a successful recruiter will get a person to internalize that stuff, like there's something wrong in him. And if you don't do something, this is what the future looks like. You know, our kids aren't even going to remember our former ways of being. This is just going to go on. But if you take certain action, we can turn this around. So that's kind of a common way of terrorist recruiting.
Yeah, that's a really great example, and certainly something that we've experienced with ISIS is their ability to be able to use the stories to their advantage to generate recruitment. I was curious from a maybe from a national security perspective, and Brian, based on your history and everything. I mean, you talk about the competing stories and everything. I'm curious from your perspective, how well does the State Department with their embassy country teams work within that, or even understand that themselves? That sort of everything they do is either contributing to resonance or dissonance within the country. Because of course, when we're talking outside areas of hostilities, for us, the military, we're going in there for special operations. We're tying in with that country team. A lot of times they're the ones giving us the perspective. It may not be us out in the populace per se, getting that firsthand knowledge, but I'm interested in your perspective on that.
One, the simple answer is it depends. It depends on the embassy. It depends on the personnel. I've met some foreign service officers who were absolute regional and national geniuses. Like, they really got it. They understood the details and were really value added. And then I met with, I don't know, quite more than more than the others. So I would say the majority don't. And part of the challenge is, much as is true with the civil affairs community and the PSYOP community, where you guys tend to bounce around from region to region. And even recently, well, maybe not super recently, but over the last 19 years, even our special forces community has bounced around quite a bit. So you would get guys outside of their regional area of operations. And and State Department people are expected to go from region to region. And it's the rare person who spends their entire career in one region, because the expectation is they go to 2 or 3. And those guys who go to 2 or 3 tend to be less valuable in terms of helping you to understand. Even if they go to lots of meetings, they're very intelligent, but they don't necessarily recognize the different narratives. I think they will be too quick. What's interesting about Americans is we are too quick to agree. We're too quick to agree with people with whom we're negotiating. I think because somebody told us that, maybe it's the guy who wrote How to Make Friends and Influence People. I don't know, that you need to agree with people to get agreement. And we're also too quick to see agreement between cultures. So I've heard lots, both from State Department people and senior military people, that, oh, these guys in country, whatever, X, they're just like people I knew and worked with in country H, right? Like, I wanted to pick a letter way different than the alphabet. So, because like maybe they worked in South America or Central America in their previous job, and now they're working in the Middle East, or vice versa. And they will recognize similarities between tribal cultures, maybe in different regions. They'll recognize similarities in people who are struggling with their government, but they won't necessarily recognize the differences. And even though the differences are nuanced, the nuances really, really matter when we're talking about this business. So the example I use, and it's probably not a politically correct example, but is we share about 99%, depending on what study you look at, of our DNA with a chimpanzee. And that 1% is a huge difference. So yes, maybe Iraqis and, I don't know, Moroccans are 99% the same, but that 1% can be a huge difference. And if you aren't sensitive enough to recognize those differences, then you can miss the specifics. Now that's my negative side. And now to be a little bit more optimistic, the key thing is just to recognize, as Ajit suggested, and quite often the State Department can help you do this, is what are the general narratives, or rather not, well, it can be a part of their narrative. It depends on how deep our relationship is with that country. But certainly, what are their stories about the United States? Not just what are the government stories, but what are the people on the street stories? That's also a challenge with State Department people, depending on the country, depending on the region. So most of my experience with State Department is in the Middle East. And because the Middle East, walking down the street, has some danger, a lot of State Department folks, a lot of embassy employees did not spend a lot of time talking to average Iraqis or average Jordanians, because they were, and in many cases rightfully, concerned about doing that. And as a result, the stories that they heard tended to be educated stories or elite government stories, and they weren't the stories on the street and what the average person was saying, or how they were interpreting. So in this case, it's like, what is the actual interpretation of data? And how does that work? So an event happens, the United States does something, and how does that get interpreted? I would love to be over in the Middle East right now with all of these different peace deals or recognitions, diplomatic recognition deals being cut. I would love to hear what the person on the street is saying or thinking about them. Because one, that's not getting reported in our media at all. And it is telling in terms of how long lasting it can be. The other part, so one is recognizing that the initial thing, like how are Americans perceived? And because we tend to agree quite quickly as Americans, we also assume that other people do as well. We also, and this is sort of maybe unfair of us, but we tend to look at relationships as transactional more than a lot of cultures. And therefore we think, well, I jokingly say that basically most of our influence operation boils down to bribery or bullying. And as a parent now of 4 adult children, I can shamedly say that a lot of my parenting was bribery or bullying. So I recognize that bribery and bullying can be effective, but that's not the best way to influence, because ideally what you want is you want people to want what you want absent your presence. So absent your bribery or absent your bullying. That's what real influence is. And if you don't understand how you're perceived, then you miss the hard work that you need to do. Like, how hard is the work that you need to do to overcome that? And once again, it really does depend on the quality of the people in the embassy. One of the things I realized as a foreign area officer, that one of my jobs was not, like, they were better translators of Arabic than I was. But one of the things that translators usually couldn't do is they couldn't translate military speak to State Department speak. And that's a translation process that needs to happen, or even to interpret, yes, he said those words, but like one of my favorite stories was because I was an exchange officer with the Jordanian army. And so quite often I would be in meetings with US government officials and Jordanians, and I was there as a Jordanian, not there as an American. And so I would be in the meeting before the Americans arrived, and I would be in the meeting after the Americans left. And I would hear how the American words were interpreted. And in some cases, I would spend, in one case in particular, I spent 45 minutes explaining what the Americans said. And the Jordanians in the room understood the English, but they understood it as normal English, as, you know, whatever you want to call it, civilian English, I guess. And I had to explain, no, you know, for the military, when he said that, that actually means this. And I don't know that they ever actually believed me, but it was 45 minutes of trying to convince them that what they were saying was not offensive, that they were actually interested in partnering on this issue. But they just said it in a way that, once again, the Americans thought that there was no problem, because I went to the embassy after that meeting and told them, okay, hey, you need to go and apologize. And they're like, what? We didn't mean that. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I spent 45 minutes saying you didn't mean that, but this is what they heard. And recognizing that difference between what you say and what they hear is just absolutely critical. And that gets into this narrative aspect, how they filter, how they perceive the words you speak.
Hey, that's, yeah, great perspective on that. And just going back to something that Ajit had said in the beginning. So, you know, we stood up this global engagement center, which has a mandate to counter adversary propaganda and disinformation. Obviously, a lot of what we're doing is focused on the social media space. And you had kind of talked to a little bit in the beginning about how the receiver, you know, the individual who's looking at that disinformation is going to interpret it based on their personal identity and their sort of views. So I was wondering if you could actually talk some more about that, because I'm very curious about your perspective on it.
Yeah, just building off what Brian said, even about, you know, when I was an undergraduate, I was a communications major, and we were taught that our goal is to get the message from the sender to the receiver as clearly and as, as without interference, right? Just get it there. As though the receiver is just this blank slate willing to, just open, and you're going to just dump this information in their brain. Where in fact the receiver has what I sometimes describe as a meaning map in their head. It's their narrative. And so how your message is going to get received depends on their meaning map. Doesn't matter, their meaning map is more important than your message even. And it may be so different that, for example, the way you send the message may matter a lot. The person who conveys the message may matter a lot. The way that you address the receiver, honorably or not, or too casually or whatever, may really affect the way your message is being received. So people are not blank slates, and messages are not things that you translate over and dump in their head, but their meaning map or their narrative, their cognitive scheme is going to determine how that information is processed. So the other way to put it is like, somebody may hear a weird sound, a gunshot or something, and somebody may freak out. They haven't heard a gunshot before, or they've heard too many gunshots or whatever, they're going to freak out from it. And another guy may never have heard a gunshot and doesn't know what that is and is not particularly afraid of it, because their cultural background is just, they do not register that sound as something they should be afraid of. They don't categorize it as, okay, this is danger. In fact, some people, I might hear a firecracker or a car backfire or something. I'm not jumping out of my seat, but some guy sitting next to me might. It just depends on what we've been trained to, how we've been trained to perceive that sound even. So never mind a complicated message. So to design our messages, and just to be clear, narrative comes first, and then stories, and then messages. So we don't want to do it backwards. We don't want to just send a message. We got to know what the narrative is. We got to know what the stories are. And then we design a message to get interpreted the way we want, because we know our target audience so well that we can design a message that refers to the stories, which maps onto their narratives in a way that is somehow helps them out. It'll be received best if it somehow helps them out. And that, bottom line again, is identity. It somehow bolsters their identity.
Okay, I just want to jump in on that really quickly, because one, Ajit is absolutely right, and this is an important point. And when we think about the memes that have value, that sort of stick around and make a difference, is those are memes that are supportive of messages, that are supportive of stories, the military loves talking about nesting things. And for a meme to work, for any little thing, for a commercial jingle to work, whatever that thing to be catchy is, it has to be nested in all of these things in a way that just plays out. And that's why some things work and catch and other things don't.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I think, what I come back to is I've seen this evolution over time, and as a psychological operations officer, we're very much about the target audience analysis and trying to look through that cultural lens. And that's why special operations puts us all through this additional training when it comes to regional analysis. And they partner us here where we have PhDs in these cultural areas and everything. But there's still, an echelon within the government, some difficulty, because there is that tendency to jump straight to the message. And I do see that more and more now when we're talking about disinformation, because I think that the technique that is utilized is, well, we'll just expose it. We'll just put out something that exposes that whatever China's doing or whatever is a lie. And then people therefore will care and will therefore, be on board with US government policy objectives. And so I think that's kind of, Ajit, what's resonating with me is it's that simple exposing of disinformation as a tactic isn't necessarily a panacea to trying to get support for your policies.
Well, here's one of the things I want to jump in, and maybe I'm jumping in on Ajit here, but when we say China is lying and we wonder why that doesn't resonate, what we're assuming is, because we think we tell the truth, is that the audience to whom we're speaking also thinks we're telling the truth, that we're providing two different coins, right? Like, okay, China's a lying coin, that this is false, and we, on the other hand, are being truthful. So you need to listen to us because we will tell you the truth, but China lies. And of course, that is not how much of the world sees us. And once again, 2020 has sort of shown that that's not how most Americans, or I don't know most, but certainly a significant chunk of Americans doesn't even perceive that the American government tells the truth. So I think that there's a naivete in how we address this issue of truth that is problematic, because when you talk to public affairs officers, they quite often will say, get the truth out as quickly as possible. And the very implication of what they're saying is that there's one truth, that there is a truth that everybody understands. And I know that, and I'm not trying to get into this whole anything can be true, nothing is true kind of thing, but it is important to recognize that there isn't necessarily one truth. Or certainly one perception of truth, if you go with that. And I quite often tell my students, hey, we're not talking about truth because this is not a philosophy or a religion class. I mean, if you want to address truth, that's philosophy and religion. If you're getting at what is our story and why is our story beneficial to you, why is our story of benefit, I think that there's something fundamentally true that the Chinese story is not of benefit to most global players, whereas the American story does benefit most participants in it. And so whether or not the American story is true is actually almost irrelevant to the argument. It is beneficial. So that's why you ought to buy into it. Not because that there's some metaphysical truth associated with it, but I think that that's just a danger when we use the word true versus lies.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that's something that certainly has complicated what we do for psychological operations. Is just sort of that, where has the U.S. government gone on these matters, and that's the direction that I see. Is that just by virtue of countering disinformation, that's the game you need to be in. And so, again, going back to Ajit's point on, they might not even care, your particular audience might not even care that the information is in fact false. They might, because it's whatever's going to resonate with them. So great point.
Well, and it's also how much false, because when you think about it, the best disinformation campaigns have a lot of information in them. And this is particularly why I think both Russia and China have been rather successful, although I would argue Russia has not been nearly as successful as others have been in promoting Russia's message. Russia's efforts to disrupt the American campaign in 2016 was nothing new. I mean, the Soviet government was trying to interrupt American elections or confuse the American electorate for, 70 years. It's probably going on for almost 100 years at this point. So it's nothing new. What was new was how everybody, because there was this probably at least bifurcated, significant American narrative, that there were groups that they latched onto that story way harder than other people. And this is something that I think Russia and China in part are doing better than us is because they're putting material out across a broad spectrum. To them, they actually don't need to really understand our narratives, but we tell them our narratives quite freely. So if they pay attention, they can understand them, but they're broadcasting to everybody. So they're, well, not broadcasting, they're narrowcasting a lot of different messages across a very broad spectrum. So they'll send stuff that appeals to the alt-right. They'll send stuff that appeals to the illiberal left, if you want. And they'll get these messages all along the line. So people who are inclined to think that America is a racist, horrible country, China and Russia will pump out messages and little bots that support that. People who think that America is awesome as it is, and all these other people are subversive, will pump out messages about that. And they push out these bots across the spectrum. And it allows them to gain success because of that. We don't push out, I don't think, well, I'm not familiar. I am familiar with some stuff, but I'm not familiar with enough. I don't think we push out across the whole spectrum of a target country and just hope that we're going to get it. But in part, this is the same reason why terrorists are good actors, but not good governors. Because terrorist actions don't need to do anything other than destroy. And to govern, you have to build, and building requires much more effort and much more significant work. Whereas, and the same thing is true of disinformation. Disinformation just needs to destroy trust in a system. It doesn't need to build trust in a system. So all it's focused on is generating dissonance. There's no intent to generate resonance. The American system of how we try to do this business is, to a degree, we're trying to do both. So we're trying to target a community with dissonance messages, and we're trying to target another community with resonance messages. And when you look at least my understanding, and I'm not an expert in disinformation specifically, but when you look at Russian disinformation and Chinese disinformation, I don't think there are any building messages. There's no resonance messages. They're almost all dissonance messages. And to a degree, that's just easier work. It's a lighter lift. And I think that that's why they do better at it. Ours is a heavier lift if we're trying to build something.
Let me just briefly talk about counter narratives and counter messaging, because I think they're a bad idea. And this kind of goes, I'm following on what Brian said. It's easier to know what to message when we're countering something, but that is really not a good idea in most cases, unless, because boy, it can really backfire. And we've seen cases of that, unless you really know what you're doing. But the other part of that is, it's not a good idea to repeat the adversarial message. Because even, if you put the word no in front of it, or don't do this, say no to drugs, what the brain hears is the adversarial message again. And the United States of America repeating the message of some group like Daesh, not a good idea. We're legitimizing it by doing that. And we're not only legitimizing it, we're reinforcing it. So in most cases, I think we should disengage from counter narratives. And that has been, to the extent, from what I understand about what the military does in terms of messaging, I think that there's been a real emphasis on counter messaging, counter narratives. To the extent that you guys are talking about narratives, it's been countering. But we need to have an offensive narrative. Defense is all good, but we need to put our own narrative out there. And that has to not directly oppose adversarial narratives, but kind of swallow up their meaning. So for example, Islam is under attack. That's not a narrative. That's kind of the title of a Daesh narrative, right? And where we see it. And so instead of saying, no, Islam is not under attack, because that's not going to resonate. People have too much information to the opposite. An example would be some sort of story that says, yeah, Islam is under attack, but look who's doing the attacking. So you don't oppose it, but you swallow it up and give it alternative meaning within your own context. So you provide a context that is larger than that adversarial narrative that reorients its meaning.
Okay, I want to like put what Ajit said in a military frame, because one, I totally agree with it. But for all those folks out there who were fire supporters, just think about it this way. Nobody builds a fire support plan primarily based off of counter battery fire. And counter narratives are like counter battery fire. They might be necessary because you may, depending on the narrative, you might in fact need to, or the message really, it's not the narrative, but it might be the story, we call it counter narrative, but it's really counter story, counter message, counter meme. And sometimes that might be a necessary thing, just as counter battery fire might be necessary and productive. But ultimately, that is not your fire plan. Your fire plan should be, as Ajit said, something that is positive, arguably offensive, not offensive in the idea of offending, but offensive in the sense of moving forward your message, you know, whatever your story, your narrative, your story, your message is. I just think consistently we don't do a particularly good job. So I just watched a movie, and I'm going to use this because I'm working on a narrative curriculum for the Defense Security Cooperation University and helping them develop their curriculum on narrative. And as part of that training, we're using a lot of movie clips, or I'm recommending that you use movie clips because I'm a big movie fan and I love movie clips. And I just watched this movie the other day. So I cycle on a stationary trainer and watch films. So that's what I do for exercise and enjoyment simultaneously. And the movie I just watched is a 2020 film called The Outpost. I don't know if either of you have seen it, but it's about Cop Keating in Afghanistan. And 2 Congressional Medal of Honor winners came from that fight that occurred. And that film, particularly the first half of it, the second half is mostly the battle and the fighting that occurs there. But the first half probably has 3 or 4 critical moments about narrative and cross-cultural communication that are just absolutely beautiful expressions of how this works and how one communicates a message, or both the value and the problems that come from cultural understanding or a lack of cultural understanding. So I just recommend folks watch that movie. One, it's always good to be reminded of why individuals are awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, but it's also, I think, great to get a sense of why understanding the culture in which you're acting really works and really matters. This is not intellectual academic stuff. This is actually save lives kind of stuff. And I wish one of the things in what I'm trying to do is to operationalize this enough to get soldiers and low-level leaders, you know, at the squad, platoon, company level, to understand and buy into this so that we can prevent more of these fights like happened at Keating, and that we lose American lives because guys just don't understand the culture and don't recognize the value of this cross-cultural communication. Anyway, that's my movie recommendation for the podcast.
Thank you for that. That's excellent. And Ajit, I agree on the counter narrative piece. I think that, you know, for the military, we're always looking to be offensive minded. That goes back to the counter battery comment there. I mean, we're always looking for it. I think what we have to deal with, and a lot of times with senior leaders not necessarily understanding how the information environment works, is that you're often put into a place where they think that to be effective, you need to try to counter what just happened. The important part for being offensive, though, is that, you know, there's this thing called the say-do gap, right? And so your words have to match your actions, and aligning that throughout the military is habitually a challenge. Some places we've done it a lot better, and where you are sort of in an area of hostilities and can muster the full force of your military in a certain respect, you're usually a little bit better with it. than other aspects. And where we're going with the competition space right now, it's going to be much more difficult, I think, to align what it is we're saying with what it is we're doing, just because there's going to be a whole lot of space out there where you don't have military forces where we're actually talking about trying to affect things. So that's a challenge for the U.S. government as a whole, but I do appreciate the comments on narrative, counter-narrative.
I don't know if you're familiar with Sohail Sheikh or Matt Yandura, but those guys are guys that I worked with in Iraq, or I worked with Sohail Sheikh on a couple of occasions, but starting in Iraq. And both of those guys sort of came up with this whole idea of what you show, what you say. And so it's a do, show, say. So it's your images, your actions, and your words. Words, deeds, images. That's the method. Sorry, it took me a while to get the right mantra down. It's been a while since I've said it, in fact. But words, deeds, images are critical to this narrative engagement and this information war. Well, actually, I think the narrative war is bigger than information war, but it's critical to both. And you're absolutely right. Because you can say, as we have in many countries, we're your friend, we're here to help, and then some village gets blown up or a wedding ceremony gets blown up. And, you know, our words can be very sincere, and we really, really do mean them. Most soldiers I know mean them. Like they want to, like they deployed to this country to do good. And yet, that action, even if it's a one-off or it's an aberrational event or it's a total accident from our part, is screams, whereas what the words we say are effectively a whisper. And so that words, deeds, images. It's actually Sergeant Major Sheikh now, I think, but he would regularly talk about, instead of shoot, move, communicate, we need to change that around to communicate, move, shoot, to where the very first thing we do is understand this communication piece. Then we figure out how we position ourselves appropriately, and then, and only then, do we shoot. And I think those are both that whole idea of words, deeds, images, and recognizing that that's part of what we build. That's a huge part of what your community does, is you guys quite often generate the images that people will see, and recognizing that each and every one of those images is either building on their existing appreciation and narrative vis-a-vis us, or it's detracting from, it's either adding to or detracting from what they already understand. The one thing that I think that is important is narratives exist, and they're not necessarily conscious, as Ajit has said, absolutely true, but narratives also change over time. Much as rivers change their course, right? They will erode and deposit sediment, and they will move over the course of a natural river will, over the course of its lifespan, in many cases, great distances. Narratives will do the same. They will adjust over time. So even if we figure out a narrative now, or we figured out a narrative 20, 30 years ago, what is incumbent on us is to recognize how those narratives are shifting and changing, which is once again why 2020 is such a useful year in understanding the American competing narratives that exist out there, because in many cases, they have changed politically. Like I would offer, one of the reasons why both 2016 and 2020 have been elections that have generated dissonance is maybe like, and I've been thinking about this, I'm still not 100% certain, but I'm mostly certain, is that they're the first two elections where the candidates were speaking to different narratives. One candidate is talking about America is awesome, and the other candidate, even if he's not talking about 1619, he's talking about, I have a dream. Like, okay, the system is good, but we've got flaws and we've got to fix them. And the other guy's saying, hey, the system is great and America is awesome and we need to run with it. And so the stories that each candidate told was solving for dissonance in different narratives. And as a result, like the part that I find fascinating when I listen to political pundits is they still act surprised of why President Trump's story did not solve for Democrat dissonance, or why Joe Biden's story did not solve for Republican dissonance. And what they don't appreciate is the fact that, well, his story wasn't intended to solve for Republican dissonance. It was intended to solve for Democrat dissonance, and vice versa. And this is such a crucial thing to recognize, and why we understand the details of recognizing how the narrative exists, and what we're doing or other people are doing that might be making it change, and what it's changing toward. Terrorists do this quite a bit, right? Like by repeated attacks. One of the things that's so sad in Gaza, and this has been years now, man, maybe almost a decade, but I remember reading a newspaper article years ago during, it's probably the 2011 fighting, or maybe it could have been all the way back to 2010, and where people in Gaza said that they recognized it was their place to suffer so that it would communicate to other people how bad the Israeli government was. And now that is not a narrative that used to be true about the Palestinian people, that they existed to suffer on behalf of communicating a message. That is a message that's a narrative that evolved that way over arguably decades. And that, to me, this dynamic aspect of narrative, it is both something that is unconscious and not individually controlled, which is why it has to be separated from story, because Ajit can tell a story, I can tell a story, and we can control that story, but we can't control that narrative. However, that narrative can move and can be changed.
Yeah, I really appreciate the conversation with both of you. Yes, this is something near and dear to what it is that we do, but we see the same thing, right? We have to educate across the force, because this is not something that has been at the forefront of training and education for our military as a whole, for the joint force. And that's something that we have to all kind of raise the boats on in terms of the education level, because the information space matters, what people think matters, culture matters, right? And certainly narrative, story, message as a hierarchy. So thank you for bringing that out. And I hope to run into you all at some point if we ever get the opportunity.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
This has been The Indigenous Approach. We hope you have enjoyed this episode. Follow us on social media, and if you have suggestions for topics or guests, send us a message. Thank you for listening.